Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
On this vote, the yeas are 66, the nays are 30. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to, and the point of order fails. Under the previous order, the motion to commit and all pending amendments are withdrawn. The bill is considered read a third time, and the question occurs on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn.
No, it's loud here.
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, I got it. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Arono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, I do not. Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer,
Skyler.
Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema,
Senator Rounds.
Ms. Smith,
Lights didn't work, and he was trying to fix it, and I said, you can't fix it.
Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan,
And he went out and got some Christmas tree lights.
Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune,
He was like, if you want these, I'm like,
Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
On this vote, the yeas are 76, the nays are 20. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed.
Madam President. Madam President, can we have some order, please?
Yes. The Senate will be in order.
Can we have some order, please?
The Democratic leader.
Thank you, Madam President. So tonight, the Senate finally corrects a 50-year mistake by passing the Social Security Fairness Act. Millions of retired teachers and firefighters and letter carriers and state and local workers have waited decades for this moment. No longer will public retirees see their hard-earned Social Security benefits robbed from them thanks to this bill. It's a very good thing that one of the final acts of the 118th Congress is delivering a huge win for working Americans. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their outstanding work, particularly Senators Brown, Collins, Cassidy, who led the way, and all those who relentlessly across the country called their senators and got this done. And then, Madam President, tonight the Senate delivers more good news for America. Tonight the Senate delivers good news for America. There will be no government shutdown right before Christmas. This is a good bill. It'll keep the government open and funds and helps Americans affected by hurricanes and natural disasters, helps our farmers, and avoid harmful cuts. We have order, please.
The Senate will be in order.
After a chaotic few days in the House, it's good news that the bipartisan approach in the end prevailed. It's a good lesson for next year. Both sides have to work together. But by dealing with people who've had trouble with disasters, by helping our farmers avoiding harmful cuts, this is a good bill, and I'm glad we're passing it. I thank my Republican colleagues for working with us to move this bill quickly through the Senate. It's a good outcome for America and the American people. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 10545, which the clerk will report.
H.R. 10545, an act making further continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2025, and for other purposes.
There will now be up to 30 minutes for debate, equally divided.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Washington.
Madam President, I will not use 15 minutes, but I do want to just let our colleagues know that I am very pleased that we're on the verge of passing long overdue relief, desperately needed by communities who are recovering from disaster, as well as avoiding a damaging shutdown. The only reason it took so long and this much chaos to get here is that House Republicans chose chaos and chose to follow the whims of the richest man in the world. Needless to say, that is not how this should work, but I am glad that at the end of the day, we will avoid a shutdown and get disaster relief out to families and communities who are struggling after being hit by hurricanes and fires and floods and so much more. I worked hard with members on both sides of the aisle to finally get this aid across the line and to make sure we did so in a comprehensive way that meets the wide range of critical needs in the country. Because it is painfully clear there are so many communities who are still reeling from hurricanes and wildfires, tornadoes, flooding, and more, who really do need this support. So despite all the unnecessary chaos and delay, I am glad that we are finally here getting this done. This relief will make a critical difference for folks who've lost it all and are simply working to get their feet back underneath them. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in passing this package so we can get this over the line and avoid a needless shutdown as we head into the holidays. And finally, Madam President, one last important thing. I want to recognize my colleagues who helped pull this relief package together, especially my Vice Chair on Appropriations, Senator Collins, who's been a critical partner, our House counterparts, Congresswoman DeLauro, Congressman Cole, who have pushed so hard to get this disaster relief done. And of course, I want to thank all of our staff, especially Evan Schatz, our staff director, who worked so hard around the clock to pull together not just the disaster relief in this package, but so many other critical funding packages and proposals over the last 2 years I've been chair of the Appropriations Committee. The work is never easy, and I'm incredibly grateful to our entire team and to all of our colleagues who've been working so hard. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Maine.
Madam President, I rise to urge passage of the American Relief Act. This bill will avert a costly government shutdown. Although it is after midnight, we are going to avert it. It will deliver much-needed assistance to individuals, small businesses, and communities working to rebuild and repair in the wake of natural disasters. It provides much-needed aid to our farmers across the country who have been hit by a tidal wave of harmful economic conditions. I want to thank the many senators who contributed to this legislation, and in particular, I want to recognize Chair Murray for her leadership of the Appropriations Committee during this Congress. I hope that in the next Congress we can bring appropriations bills to the Senate floor in a timely fashion to avoid this kind of end-of-the-year pileup. I do urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I too want to recognize and thank my outstanding staff for their hard work. Finally, Madam President, I do want to say that it is a great accomplishment that tonight the Senate passed the Social Security Fairness Act, which will be sent to the President for his signature. This is long overdue, and I want to share with my colleagues one really important fact, and that is that 83% of those who are affected by the government pension offset, which we repealed tonight, are lower-income women. So this is a great accomplishment to eliminate these two inequitable, unfair provisions of the Social Security Act. It's going to make a big difference. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Democratic leader.
This is the last vote not only of this evening, but of the 118th Congress, and we yield back all time.
All time is yielded back. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
H.R. 10545, an act making further continuing appropriations and so forth and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Yeah. Thank you. Gotcha. Mr. Bennett. I was going to say, what are you doing? Yeah. Pardon.
Make sure this bill's in order. Governor. I'm trying not to make eye contact with any of you.
Capito. Yes. You too. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
You too. Thank you. Nope. Thank you. Sanders. Okay, I'll bet you. Thank you. Right.
Absolutely. 55 minutes I was on. 55 minutes. That's pretty good.
minute. Mr. Bozeman. Thank you.
As the number 2 guy in the Foreign Relations Committee, I think you should get
I got you.
Have a good holiday. I'm processing a few homeland bills.
White House eye.
Thank you.
And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to do better next year. I promise.
Merry Christmas.
It's my New Year's resolution. It's my New Year's resolution.
Thank you.
Really? You think I can ruin things like that? I'm New Year's resolution. Thank you, you too.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Good holiday.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.
I will. I'm doing well.
Okay. You bet. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you. Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
I do. I got you. Thanks, man. For sure.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Happy holidays. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
You too.
I do. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you. Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell. Oh, thank you. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. She's there. She's not. She's going to be down. Okay. Thank you. Gotcha. I gotcha. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. I did. Thank you. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirona, Mr. Hoban, Mrs. Height-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan. Thank you, Mayor. Yep. Happy Hanukkah. Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 85, the nays are 11. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume executive session to consider the following nominations in block, calendar numbers 851, 853, 854, and 857. The question occurs on the nominations in block. All in favor say aye. Any opposed, nay? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nominations are confirmed on block. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President.
From Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a moment, I will ask for unanimous consent to pass H.R. 3433, the Bipartisan Give Kids a Chance Act. I'd like to highlight how important this legislation is for children with cancer all across this country. The Give Kids a Chance Act finally authorizes the FDA to direct companies who are conducting research for adult cancer drugs to study those drugs in combination with others to see whether they also can work well for kids who have cancer. The bill continues the work that Senator Rubio and I started in 2017 when we worked together to pass the Race for Children Act, which required sponsors of certain adult cancer drugs to study the benefits or the effects and their use in children. Since then, Senator Rubio and I have both learned that combination therapies can be effective treatments and reduce risk of side effects significantly, both for adults and for kids. That's why this legislation is so important. This bill could help save the lives of children all over our country who have the most aggressive forms of cancer. It would ensure that pharmaceutical companies are being held accountable to study how their drugs affect children who may have the same kind of cancer as adults, but who need...
Please
I appreciate that, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Who appreciate more tailored treatment in combination with other drugs. I know Senator Rubio and I have both heard numerous stories from patients who have asked for themselves and parents who have asked on behalf of their children and who have advocated on behalf of children who have passed away. This bill also authorizes the FDA to take enforcement action against companies that do not conduct the pediatric trials that are required under the Pediatric Research Equity Act. It requires the FDA to report on enforcement of this act. Additionally, the bill reauthorizes the FDA Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program through fiscal year 2029, which incentivizes drug development for rare pediatric diseases. Mr. President, this bill has the support of dozens and dozens of organizations that represents kids and parents all across our country. I'd ask their names be included in the record. In the interest of time this evening, I won't read them on the floor, although I want to say how deeply I appreciate their efforts.
Without objection.
I'd also like to highlight the bipartisan nature of this work. Senator Rubio, as a co-sponsor, with Senator Casey and Mullins, who have co-sponsored provisions of this House bill as well. This bill has passed unanimously out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It has passed the House by voice vote. Mr. President, it's now the time to pass this bill. If we pass it tonight, it will go to the President for his signature. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of, and the Senate proceed to H.R. 3433. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I just want to say how deeply I regret the objection of the senator from Kentucky. That's, of course, his right. I gather that he's objecting because he objects to the lateness of the hour and the time at when this request was made. At least that's what I was told earlier tonight. I think after we have been held here in place for hours and hours and hours, the idea that we're not going to be able to pass this legislation is deeply, deeply disappointing to the people who have advocated for this for all these years. It's a reflection, I think, of how broken this place is and the way that it puts its own interests ahead of the interests of the people that we represent. But we will be back to fight another day. Mr. President, I wish you and the staff here in the Senate at this late hour, and to my colleagues that are here as well, happy holidays and Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in the new year.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to pass into law life-saving bipartisan legislation that will enable us to keep fighting the opioid and fentanyl epidemic that has destroyed families and devastated communities all across our country. New data from just this week found that drug overdose deaths dropped 17% from last summer to this summer. We now have a much better sense of what works to prevent and treat addiction, the resources we need to do so, and the light that exists on the other end of this terrible, terrible tunnel. But we can only get there if we keep up the fight. The Support Act of 2018 established vital addiction treatment infrastructure. Reauthorizing this law is essential to our addiction prevention, treatment, and recovery efforts. Just two of many examples include funding addiction treatment for pregnant women and supporting first responders. Now, the original Support Act passed the Senate with 98 votes, and the bipartisan reauthorization passed the House with 386 votes. Now the Senate must send it to the President's desk before we adjourn for the year. This is not time for complacency, nor is it time for despair. Nothing less than people's lives depend on us acting. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4531, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
The objection is heard.
And, Mr. President,
Senator from New Hampshire.
I will just say that I regret the objection. This was a Senate version of the reauthorization was, of course, included in the package that we all agreed on, bipartisan agreement in both the Senate and the House after months and months of work, reauthorized through our committee process and was stripped out, of course, on Wednesday at the instruction of Mr. Musk. So the House had already passed this bipartisan bill. It had a huge and overwhelming bipartisan support there. And this is really unfortunate because, of course, the opioid epidemic, especially the fentanyl epidemic, continues to devastate our communities. And it is truly unfortunate that the objection was made tonight. Thank you, Mr. President.
Colorado.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
So, Mr. President,
We're in a quorum call.
Ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the work of the 118th Congress comes to an end. The majority in this chamber will soon change hands. Tonight, I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleagues for their outstanding work over the past 4 years. This was the most productive, ambitious, and historic 4 years the Senate has seen in decades. I am proud that many of our biggest accomplishments were bipartisan, something I hope the incoming majority embraces as a model. And the accomplishments speak for themselves. They're enormous. I was so proud to lead the Senate when we did so much for so many people, and as I said, so much of it bipartisan. It started at the beginning in 2017 when and 2020 when COVID was at its worst. We passed the American Rescue Plan, sending checks to every mailbox and shots in every arm. It helped reduce the problems with COVID so quickly, more quickly than people ever felt. We passed a once-in-a-generation bipartisan infrastructure law. You see the effects of it all over America right now. Infrastructure is being rebuilt. People are being employed. Our country is getting more efficient, which it always does when we have better infrastructure. And it rebuilt Americans' roads and bridges and highways. It provided kids with safe drinking water. Rural communities, urban communities got access to broadband, which they had never had before, so essential in the 21st century. We brought manufacturing jobs back to our shores and revitalized American innovation through the CHIPS and Science Act. We took on the NRA and won by passing the first gun safety law in 30 years. We passed the greatest expansion of veterans care in a generation to ensure that no veteran is denied treatment related to toxic exposure in burn pits. This, and on almost every one of these issues, it was the Senate that led the way. Bipartisan, senators got together with one another and passed legislation that then the House followed and the President signed. But make no mistake about it, we were the cauldron. We were the place where it all got put together and melded together. And I'm proud of the job, frankly, that I did as Majority Leader, but I'm so proud of our senators on both sides of the aisle who got so much done. And there were other things we did as well. We stood with our friends in Ukraine as they defend their country against the brutality of Vladimir Putin. We took a stand to protect marriage equality. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, we made insulin $35 a month for millions of seniors. We empowered Medicare to negotiate with drug companies for the first time. The IRA was also the most ambitious clean energy bill in American history. The effects are happening all over the country. Our kids are going to breathe cleaner air, our community will see less pollution, and future generations are going to see millions of new good-paying jobs as we complete the wind and solar and nuclear and all the other parts of the bill. That made us so proud of what we were able to do. It was incredible. The list goes on and on. And our legacy in these past 4 years, when we were in the majority, is just large, it's grand. I'm proud of it. We also, let's not forget, confirmed 235 highly qualified and historic judges to the bench, more than a quarter of all active judges. We're so proud of this ambitious record. Years from now, when Americans drive on better roads, buy cleaner cars, make faster chips, have better paying jobs, save on prescription drugs, it'll be the work of this majority. In conclusion, I want to thank the staff here in the Senate who work behind the scenes and make this chamber come to light. The incredible floor staff sitting here who do incredible work. Thank you to the miracle workers of the cloakroom. They always find everybody wherever they are. You say someone's missing, and there they are. Thank you to the Senate doorkeepers, to the Secretary of the Senate and the Senate Sergeant at Arms, to the pages and support staff, and to all of those who make this place function. And a special thanks to my staff. What an amazing, hardworking, dedicated, smart, compassionate, caring group of people they are. I know this for sure. Without my staff, none of this would have been accomplished. They keep me going. Sometimes when I veer off course, they get me back on course. Sometimes when I'm doing too much, they sort of limit me. Oftentimes, when I want to do something that's a yes, they sometimes say no. But all too often, they find the better way to do yes. So they're great. I love them. And I'm grateful to them as well. So there'll be much to do in the year to come. The work will continue. The challenges will be great. And we will no longer be in the majority, we'll be in the minority. But our North Star will not change, working every single day to serve the American people and reward the trust they have placed in us. I yield the floor. And absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service.